Okay, welcome to session 23, and we're very close to the end of this course on Genesis. Just 2 more lessons to go. So let's ask the Lord to bless our time together as we start this lesson. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this new day. We thank you for your word. We thank you that you have called us to be in your family. We thank you that you have chosen to reveal yourself to us. Otherwise, we would know nothing about you. And that you want us to know you. You've said over and over in your word that you do things so that people will know you. And help us, Father, to know you better and better, to be more and more consistently and constantly aware of who you are. Just open our hearts, open our minds to you yourself. May we love you more and love each other more as a result of looking into your word this day. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Okay, well, we've got a brand new timeline that we're going to look at today, but for now, get out the old timeline, and we're coming down to Haggai, or Haggai. Anybody pronounce it? That's the guy that we're studying today. He is prophet number 9 on the chart. So you can fill his name in on blank number 9. And he's one of the few that we know the exact date for. It is 520 BC. So, and as for the map, he lived in Jerusalem. So actually he and Zechariah, that we'll get to next week, both lived in Jerusalem. So draw a little stick figure by Jerusalem, but leave room for a second one next week. Okay, and that brings us to our notes, and we're going to start with some background, that second paragraph there. So in order to understand what Haggai wrote, we need some background on what was happening in Israel and actually in other parts of the world that affected Israel. And so on the new timeline, you'll see some of the major events that are referred to. The first thing on the far left is that Babylon conquers Judah. So Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi all were prophets that came after the fall of Judah. Okay? So we have Babylon conquers Judah, but then guess what? In 539, Persia conquered Babylon. Remember that one of the minor prophets said, you're going to fall. God's going to punish you. And sure enough, Persia came in and conquered Babylon. And that was conquered by King Cyrus the Great. And if you look from 538 to, the conquering was 539. Within that very first year of his reign, he issued a decree that allowed exiles to return to their native countries. It wasn't just the Jews who were allowed to go back to Israel, but any exiles from any nation that wanted to go back to their homeland could. That was his determination. And the Jews certainly knew about that. So then we'll get to the other events in just a little bit. So the Jews knew that the kingdom had fallen. They no longer had their own king and all. They knew that Babylon had consequently been conquered by King Cyrus the Great of Persia. And they were very much aware that King Cyrus had said, any among you that wants to return home may. And so we're going to pick up on that story in Ezra chapter 1. And by the way, did you ever think about the fact not everybody wanted to go back? That exile, they were in exile for 70 years, so maybe you were a very old person and the prospect of making that long journey by foot would have been quite daunting, and maybe just physically you couldn't. Or maybe the ones that have grown up in Persia, they have a life there, they have a job there, and it just doesn't seem feasible. When we were One time when I was in Bangladesh, I was teaching a ladies group, and one of the ladies in that group was a Korean lady. She was the wife of the Korean pastor. And she said, oh yes, like after World War II, when North and South Korea were divided, she said it would be very hard for some people to, go back to the other side. So she understood exactly about that. But anyway, anybody that wanted to were allowed to, and of course, we know that there was a small remnant that did go back. And we picked this up in Ezra. So if you have a Bible with you, go ahead and open it to Ezra chapter 1. And we're going to read kind of some lengthy passages out of Ezra. So beginning with the very first verse, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah was fulfilled. What was that word? Do you remember? What did Jeremiah say? He said, you will go into exile, and you'll be there for 70 years. So now if you kind of look at the timeline, this is about 70 years after they were conquered. The Lord put it into the mind of King Cyrus to issue a proclamation throughout his entire kingdom and to put it in writing. Those of you that have the ESV, would one of you read where I said the Lord put it into the mind? How does your Bible word that?
The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia.
Okay, the Lord stirred up the spirit. You're going to hear, I like that. You're going to see that phrase often. He stirred up Cyrus's spirit. Listen for it, because he stirs up a lot of other spirits as well. Okay, so this is what King Cyrus wrote in his decree. He said, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and has appointed me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. Whoever is among his people, may his God be with him, and may he go to Jerusalem in Judah and build the house of the Lord. So Cyrus actually ordered that their temple be rebuilt. So that's pretty strong authority to have at your back, Let every survivor, wherever he lives, be assisted by the men of that region with silver, gold, goods, livestock, along with the free will offering for the house of God. So even if you're not planning to go yourself, give to these people that are going back. Give them some cows, give them some gold, whatever you've got that will help them when they resettle, give it to them. So Cyrus was very much for this return to your homeland thing. And so people did. So the family leaders of Judah and Benjamin, along with the priests and Levites, everyone God had motivated. And what does yours say?
Everyone whose spirit God had stirred.
Everyone whose spirit God had stirred up. So he stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus. And what that means, that stirring up the spirit, means God planted an intense desire. Cyrus felt strongly about this. He gave the people an intense desire to go back to their homeland. For some of them, it wasn't going back home because they'd never lived in their homeland, but for some of them it would be, for some of the older ones. Anyway, and it says all their neighbors supported them. So God was also stirring up the spirit, even of those who couldn't go themselves, but they gave generously to make it possible for the others to go. And not only that, if you look at verse 7, King Cyrus also brought out the articles of the Lord's house that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem. I mean, Cyrus was really committed to this. You think about silver, gold up to wazoo, from the temple. And he returned it all, counted it out, and they brought it back with them. And then chapter 2 we won't read, because if you will observe, it's a list of about 100,000 names. Ezra listed very carefully who all went back, and he does it by category. He has things like the Levites, or the temple singers, or the servants of Solomon. There it would be their descendants, but apparently that was a whole category by this time. So he's got them all by, their different categories, who all went. And then we get to chapter 3. Okay, so they have arrived in Jerusalem. It takes a little while for them to settle, you gotta arrange for a place to live and all of that. But by the 7th month, the Israelites had settled in their towns, and the people gathered together in Jerusalem. And why did they do that? Well, Jeshua, he was the high priest at the time, and Zerubbabel, he was the governor of Judah at the time that Cyrus had appointed. So the high priest and the governor and their brothers and all began to build the altar in order to offer burnt offerings on it. So even though they didn't have the temple rebuilt yet, they thought we can immediately build an altar and resume the sacrifices. So they did that. And so after they did that, they celebrated all these holy days that God had given them earlier. And then they started making plans to rebuild the temple. So if you jump down to verse 8, it says, so this is in the 7th month, they rebuilt the altar and did that. In the 2nd month of the 2nd year, after they arrived at God's house in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel, that's the governor, and Jeshua, that's the high priest, and the rest of their brothers began to build the temple. Probably it took a while to collect stone for the foundation and all of that, wood maybe to panel the walls and so on. But anyway, they started building, and when they got the foundation done, they had a big celebration. That was a big event. So we jump down to verse 10. When the builders had laid the foundation of the Lord's temple, the priests, dressed in their robes and holding trumpets, and the Levites holding cymbals, took their positions to praise the Lord. And they sang with praise and thanksgiving, for he's good, and his faithful love to Israel endures forever. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the Lord's house had been laid.
Is that where the cornerstone didn't get put in?
No, it as far as I know, the whole foundation.
There was one they cut and they threw it in the field and they forgot to put it,
Okay.
the stumbling block.
Okay. I don't know where right offhand, I can't tell you where that is.
Okay.
Okay. So people are giving this great shout and singing praises, but many of the older priests and Levites and people that had seen Solomon's temple, they wept when they saw the foundation of this one. Why? This one was so much smaller, so much less impressive. They remembered what it had been, and this, And it says, the people couldn't distinguish the sound of the joyful shouting from that of the weeping, because the people were shouting so loudly, and the sound was heard far away. And guess who heard it? Enemies, people who opposed this. Remember, they didn't go back to a vacant land. Other people had been transferred there, just as they had been transferred from their homeland. Because when conquering armies, they would just send people anywhere but where they actually used to live, So these people had houses there, they had jobs there. They weren't real thrilled about seeing the Jewish people coming back and apparently settling in for the long haul and rebuilding their temple. So what happened? When the enemies, we're down in chapter 4, when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple, they approached Zerubbabel, the governor, and the leaders and said to them, well, let us build with you. They're pretending to want to help, but they saw through that and says, you really have no part in this. King Cyrus authorized us to do it. This is our temple, and we're building it. Well, as soon as they got that kind of reply, they thought, okay, well, we'll try another way to get them. But unfortunately, King Cyrus was still on the throne. King Cyrus had said, build this temple. There wasn't a whole lot they could do at that time. But guess what? When a new king comes, now's our chance. So, verse 4, at the beginning of the reign of Ahasuerus, so Cyrus is now off the scene, The people who were already in the land wrote an accusation against the residents of Judah and Jerusalem. And they said these people have been rebellious, and if you allow them to build this temple, they're just going to rebel against you. That's what they've always done in the past, and that's why they were conquered. And they're going to cause you trouble, and you're going to lose your tax money, And so the king heard that, and he sent a letter in reply. And we're starting down in verse 18. The king's letter said, "The letter you sent us has been translated and read in my presence. I issued a decree, and a search was conducted. It was discovered that this city has had uprising against kings since ancient times, and there have been rebellions and revolts in it, and so on and so on and so on." He says, "Therefore," in verse 21, "issue an order for these men to stop, so that this city will not be rebuilt until a further decree has been pronounced by me. See that you don't neglect this matter." Well, they did not neglect it. If you go down to the bottom of verse 23, it says, these guys immediately went to the Jews in Jerusalem and forcibly stopped them. So if you look again at the new timeline, you see the work began, and they worked on it a few years, but then they were stopped. And for at least the next 10 years, there was nothing they could do, because now they had a new king with a new order that said, no, you're not doing this. Not until you hear from me, and he never wrote back again about it. So that was that. But then something very interesting happened. Let's see if I can find it. If we go down to chapter 5, actually the last verse of chapter 4. "Now the construction of God's house in Jerusalem had stopped and remained at a standstill until the second year of the reign of King Darius," new king. "And when the prophets Haggai and Zechariah prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, then Zerubbabel," that's the governor, "and Jeshua," that's the high priest, "began to rebuild." They still haven't got an official blessing from the ruling king, but these two prophets came and preached, and immediately these people started rebuilding. And it says the prophets of God were with them, helping them. So Haggai didn't just preach and say, well, now I've done my job. He was actually in there, slinging his hammer and whatever they used to build that temple. And a number of years ago, when I was studying this, it was actually during my first term in Bangladesh, I was reading through Ezra, and when I came to that, it just kind of stopped me cold. I thought, what on earth did those two men say that had that kind of impact on the people? Because, they have been fearful. They've had opposition the whole time. They've been there. They've got this very strong directive from a new king, don't work on the temple. What did they say that caused them to not be afraid to fly in the face of that and start working again? So I thought, fortunately, we don't have to wonder. We can actually turn to their books and see what they said. So, let's see. Okay, so again, people around them observed, it was pretty obvious, they're building this building again. There's all these people pounding on rocks and cutting and sawing and whatever they did in the building. It's not a quiet process, and there were a lot of people involved. Then their people came, or the opponents came and says, "What are you doing? And what are your names? We're gonna send this back to the king." So they sent a letter to Darius. And their letter wasn't as harsh. It wasn't an accusation. We'll see that it begins in verse 8 of chapter 5. It says, "Let it be known to the king that we went to the house of the great God in the province of Judah. It's being built with cut stones, and its beams are being set in the walls. This work is being done diligently and succeeding through the people's efforts. So we questioned the elders and asked, who gave you the order to rebuild this temple? And we also asked them for their names, so we could write down the names for your information, and then they give them a little bit of the history. So we jump down to verse 17. So, if it pleases the king, let a search of the royal archives be made to see if it's true that a decree was issued by King Cyrus to rebuild this temple. And so Darius was quite a diligent man. He didn't just take their word for it. He did search the archives, and he found a scroll with the very record of it. Not only was it to be rebuilt, but it even said it's to be 90 feet tall and 90 feet wide, and the cost is to be paid from the royal treasury, and so on and so on. So, he says, I found this, and then verse 6, therefore, you stay away from that place. Don't bother them, in other words. Leave the construction of the house of God alone, and let the governor and elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its original site. I hereby issue a decree concerning what you must do so that the elders can rebuild it. The cost is to be paid in full out of the royal revenues. So he's not only saying, yes, you leave them alone, let them rebuild, and then moreover, you pay for it. Give them money out of, and give them whatever they need, day by day. Young bulls, rams, lambs for burnt offerings, wheat, salt, wine, oil, as requested by the priests. Let it be given to them without fail. And then he really underscores it down in verse 11. I also issue a decree concerning any man who interferes with this directive of mine. Let a beam be torn from his house and raised up, and he'll be impaled on it, and his house will be made into a garbage dump. But, well, again, you have a king that is strongly supporting the building of the temple. So, but like I said, so we now have a little bit of the history of what's happened. So let's turn to Haggai and see what he preached, what his messages were. He has a series of 3 or maybe 4 little messages, and he's very specific about when they occurred. He says, in the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came through Haggai to Zerubbabel, that's the governor, and to Joshua, whom Ezra calls him Jeshua, who's the high priest. And the Lord says this, you know what these people, these exiles are saying? They're saying, well, I guess the time it's just not time yet for the temple to be rebuilt. Now remember, this is when they're in the middle of this stop order. And it's been years and years, and they don't see any hope on the horizon, so they're just kind of shrugging their shoulders. Well, I guess it's just not God's will, but this must not be the time. But God is saying to them in verse 3, is it a time for you yourselves to live in paneled houses? Your houses are paneled beautifully with wood. You're fixing up your own houses, while this house, meaning the temple, lies in ruins. And you think carefully about your ways, God said. You're focusing on fixing your houses up, and you're neglecting my house. He says, you're going through a time of drought and famine right now. You planted much, but you harvested little. You never have enough to be satisfied and eat. You never have enough. You can drink a little bit, but you don't have enough to become drunk, even if you wanted to. You put on clothes, but you never have enough to really get warm. And the wage earner puts his wages into a bag with a hole in it. In other words, you're not really prospering so well. You know why? God says in verse 7, think carefully about your ways and go up into the hills and bring down lumber and build the house, meaning my house. And then I will be pleased with it. You expected much, but it amounted to little. And when you brought the harvest to your house, I ruined it. I ruined it. Why? because my house still lies in ruins, while each of you is busy with his own house. So on your account, the skies have withheld the dew, and the land its crops. I brought the drought on everything that your hands produce. So God is reprimanding them for their careless attitude. And the people's response is really amazing. They don't get mad, they don't throw stones at Haggai for saying this rather difficult thing to say to somebody. It says, then Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua, the high priest, and the entire remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord. In other words, they started going up into the hills and bringing in wood for the temple. They started working on it. So the people feared the Lord. And Haggai declared the Lord's message, I am with you, says the Lord. And that is so significant because their enemies are still there. Their enemies haven't gone anywhere. There's still this opposition. There's still maybe people spying on them. But God says, I am with you. So don't be afraid of that. And here we have again in verse 14. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the governor, and Joshua, the high priest, and the spirit of all the remnant of the people. So that was the first message he had. He said, you're too busy with your own houses and you've neglected mine, now get with it. Start working on my house again. So now, in the second chapter, we get a new message. On the 21st day of the 7th month, well, that's just about 1 month later from the first message, again, the word of the Lord comes through Haggai, and he says, speak to the governor again, and speak to the high priest, and to the remnant of the people, and ask them, among all of you, who's left that saw the glory of the former temple? You know, I did. Others, no, I grew up in Persia. Well, how does it seem to you now, this new temple? Does it seem like nothing to you? Remember, they wept because it was nothing compared to Solomon's. He says, don't be concerned about that. He says, be strong, Zerubbabel. Be strong, Joshua, and be strong, all of you people. Work, for I am with you. They've been working for a month now, but they're getting a little discouraged, I think, because they're seeing things take shape. But again, they're also seeing it's not like the old one, And God tells them, he says, a day is coming, we're down now in verse 7, I will shake all the nations, so that the treasures of all the nations will come, and I'm going to fill this house with glory. The silver and gold belong to me, and the final glory of this house will be greater than the first. I will provide peace in this place. Now at this point, the Lord probably is speaking of the New Jerusalem, but nonetheless, he says, don't be concerned about how it looks. I'm going to fill this place with glory.
I always thought that at that time when part of the people were praising the joy, I thought the ones that were crying, were crying out of gladness, emotion, that we're, we came back and we're doing this. But this kind of does sum this up, doesn't it, when the Lord is saying that, he'll make it more glorious.
Mm-hmm. And so he's giving him that comfort, and the will to go on, because this is a lot of work. It takes years. This wasn't built in a day or even a year. We're building it by hand, essentially. Okay, so that's the second message. And so that was given in the 7th month, and then about the same time in the 9th month, so 2 months later, another message came. And he says, ask the priest for a ruling. So I'm setting up this little test here. Ask him, if a man is carrying consecrated meat, you've got meat that was offered, to the Lord, and you're taking it back for your priest family to eat it. If that consecrated meat touches something else, will that something else become holy? And they said, well, no. It was the meat that was consecrated, not whatever it touched. He says, okay. Well, what if some person becomes unclean or defiled because they touched a dead body? And that was part of the law. if that unclean person touches something else, does it become unclean? And they said, well, yes. And he says, that's what's happened. You have become unclean because of your former practices, and that's why your crops were defiled. But now, I want you to mark this day. What day? The 24th day of the 9th month. You mark it down, write it down somewhere so you don't forget, and you start watching. You start watching your crops. You're going to see that from this day forward, your crops are going to be blessed. And you're going to have an abundance. Because now you are obeying, and now you are working diligently to build my temple. So you mark it down so that you know exactly when to start comparing what was with what's going to be. We see that down in verse 19, kind of a summary. Is there still seed left in the granary? The wine, the fig, the pomegranate, the olive tree have not yet produced, but from this day on I will bless you. And then the last message that Haggai had was very personal. It was for the governor himself. And I'm down in the middle of page 2. Haggai's last message is meant for Zerubbabel, the governor of Judah. Zerubbabel was of royal descent. In other words, he was of the line of David. He was actually an heir to the Davidic throne. And if Judah had not fallen, if Judah was still a sovereign little nation, he might well have come back to Israel as King Zerubbabel, not Governor Zerubbabel, governor under somebody else's authority. So God sends him a very personal word of encouragement, and he tells him that someday he's going to shake up all kings and nations and remove them from power so that he can set his own king in place. And at that time, he says, and this is found at the very end of the book of Zechariah, he says, at that time I will take you, Zerubbabel, my servant, and I'm going to make you like my signet ring, for I have chosen you. Well, what was a signet ring? That was the ring that was the symbol of the king's authority. I'm going to say, I am backing you. You have my authority. Remember, what did Pharaoh do when he appointed Joseph second in command?
Give him the ring.
He took off the signet ring that he himself was wearing, gave it to Joseph as a symbol. You now have my authority. And he tells Zerubbabel, I'm going to do that for you. I'm going to make you, you're like my signet ring. You're going to be my symbol. And we've already talked about that in doing that, Jacob in essence gave Joseph the double portion. But actually, the firstborn traditionally inherited 3 different important rights. One was the priesthood. Now, I don't mean like the Levitical priests. I mean priests in the sense that we as believers are priests. We intercede for each other. We go before God on behalf of other people. Okay, the head of the family would do that for his family. You think of Job, every day it says he offered sacrifices. Maybe my children have sinned, so he was interceding for them constantly. So the priesthood, the kingship in regard to the family, in other words, the firstborn became the head of the family, and the double inheritance. Those 3 things, the priesthood, the kingship, and the double inheritance. But you notice that Jacob didn't give all 3 to Joseph. He only gave the double inheritance. Who got the kingship? Judah. The scepter shall not depart from his hand. And who ultimately got the priesthood? Levi, the line of Levi. So those 3 things kind of got separated until they're reunited in Jesus Christ, who will be king and priest. And owns it all. The cattle on 1,000 hills. And then I just like the very last sentence of the last paragraph, that God blesses his people by arranging their lives to accomplish his purposes. And that Jacob ended his life full of thankfulness. Jacob, who wavered, he selfish and everything happens to me one day, and then, grateful to God the next. But it seems like at the end of his life, he really saw things in the right perspective and was giving glory to God, and God did that for him. All right, so with that, with the time that we have left, let's look at the homework. And I know that the ladies last night said this was a hard week. Some of the questions, and I wasn't even sure exactly what Jim was getting at for part of it, but let's just go through it and see what we can come up with. Whoops, I'm on the wrong chapter. Okay, page 164, and I'll do what I did the last few weeks. I'll give you my summaries, and then if you have anything you want to add to it, we'll do that. Okay, so for chapter 48, Jacob blesses Joseph's two sons, giving Ephraim the rights of the firstborn. Okay, so that was basically what the whole chapter was about. And the next whole chapter was his words of prophecy. I want to say blessing, but some of it didn't sound too much like a blessing, Anyway, but his words of prophecy for the remaining sons, and his instructions regarding his burial and his death. So, in the first chapter, he blesses Joseph's two, the firstborn's two, you might say. In the next chapter, he blesses all the remaining ones, or prophesies, and says, bury me back in Canaan, and he dies. And then chapter 50, we have the actual burial of Jacob in Canaan. They obeyed what he asked them to do. We have Joseph reassures his fearful brothers who think, oops, now that dad's dead, he could come after us. And he says, no. And then Joseph's instructions regarding his bones and his death. So that's pretty much the end of Genesis. Okay, how old is Jacob in this deathbed scene in chapter 48?
147.
147 years old, okay? How long has he been in Egypt? 17 years. So how old would that make Joseph?
56. Why did I write 56?
Well, let's think about it. How old was Joseph when his family first came to get grain? He was 17 when he was sold.
Right.
But how old was he when he came into power in the Pharaoh? I think somewhere it said he was about 34, 35. So now, his father has come, so you'd add 17 more years onto that, and you would get up around 56, 60, somewhere. He wasn't a real young man at this time.
I got that wrong. I put almost 50.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't know if we know the exact date, but anyhow, it wasn't. And how about his two sons? How old do you think Ephraim and Manasseh?
I found 19, about 19. I don't know if I Googled it or somewhere I found it said about 19.
I guessed about 25.
Anybody else?
20.
Okay, I had something like 45, and I'm trying to think why I thought that. They were born before his father arrived, so they're at least in their teens.
They were born in the first part of the famine, were they?
Yeah,
Or they were there when the famine started?
they were there when the famine started, so, yeah.
Yeah, I had noted if Joseph was 30 when they were born,
He's 60 when his father dies.
Yeah, so I mean, they're not young kids, which is a little funny because it talks about him putting them on his father's knee.
Yeah.
You think a 30-year-old man? But anyway, so I don't know exactly. And I don't know why she asked that. I haven't listened to the podcast yet, so I hope she addresses this because we don't get an answer key with these. Okay, and 33, or number 3, was just filling in the blank. Jacob reminded Joseph that he had received a blessing directly from God Almighty, and he was promised the land of Canaan and to be possessed by his seed or offspring or descendants, any of those words fit. And we've already talked about the fact, for question number 4, that when he says, I'm adopting your 2 sons as my own, or taking them as my own, that meant he was giving Joseph a double blessing. Now, I'm not sure what Jen was getting at in question 5. It says, because Jacob gives this blessing before blessing any of his other sons, what can we guess is true about it? Anybody have a?
But I thought that it shows that he still favors Joseph
Okay,
over the other brothers.
that can well be.
I noted they received the first portion.
Okay,
I just put he had great love for Rachel's 2 sons.
yeah. And I think he is showing that in his mind, he is appointing Joseph as the firstborn, because you always bless the firstborn first,
Mhm.
you know, on the deathbed. So I think he was that was his way of saying, you know, Reuben, I don't think it was any shocking surprise that Reuben didn't get it, or Simeon, or Levi. But maybe he might have settled on Judah, but he's saying very clearly, no, it's Joseph. So whether it's still that old favoritism, or whether, because at this point in his life, he really is ready to die, and it seems like he's got more of God's perspective on things.
Joseph did more for the family than Judah did.
Right, exactly. You know,
Right.
so for what, and it might have been a mixture of things, you know, we are complex people, and we rarely do things for a reason. But anyway,
It's
that's,
always seemed to me that Jacob looked on Rachel as his legitimate wife.
mhm.
Yeah. This is my real wife.
Yeah,
These are
yeah,
my real
yeah,
kids.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
And
These,
Hang on to that thought, because when we come to where he's buried, we'll look at that.
yeah, I
Um,
thought that was interesting.
And, okay, so he's old, his eyesight has grown weak. Deja vu, it must run in the
Yeah,
family, in the
yeah,
genes,
I
because
wrote that
Isaac had
down
that
too.
problem.
Yeah.
What is he very careful to make sure of in Genesis 48:8-10?
Which one was the youngest? And which one was
He
the
would,
oldest?
he did tricking the younger for the
Right,
elder.
but before he
Yes.
blessed them, what did he do?
He
asked-
switched hands.
He switched hands, but before he did that, he asked Joseph a question. He says, who are these that are with you? I mean, I'm sure he had a good idea it was the sons.
Right.
He wanted to hear it. I want to make sure I've got the right people here before I bestow any
Oh,
blessings.
yeah, about the Esau.
Because
Deja
remember,
Yeah.
he tricked
Yeah.
his own
Yeah.
father.
Yeah.
And the father kept asking, now who are you? Who are you? And he kept
Yeah.
saying, I'm Esau, I'm Esau.
Yeah.
So who are these that are with you? I want to make sure. And you're right, then he did his own thing. And, okay, well, let's jump to day 3. And, did you have trouble filling out this chart? Some of it I wasn't sure of, but anyway, I'll tell you what I had, and you can tell me what you had. They asked for any descriptions or adjectives. Well, for Simeon and Levi, it was said that they were angry, that they had cruel fury, that they were murderers. And the only metaphor I could find maybe was knives. It seemed to be that they were weapons, you know, that would harm people.
Okay, the ESV says sword.
Swords, okay, yeah. But anyway, a sharp instrument that's
Yes.
meant to kill, you know, it's not a good thing to be compared with. Judah, however, he's praiseworthy, and it says he's going to hold the scepter. In other words, he will rule or reign, or kings are going to come from him. And he's compared with a young lion, and I think wine and milk also. Zebulun, I didn't find any description, I just saw that it said he's going to live by the seashore.
That's what I thought.
And then the only metaphor I could think of was a harbor. If you live by the seashore, but I don't know if it actually, I don't know,
No, it said haven for ships,
haven for ships,
which
okay.
is a harbor.
Yeah, okay, the haven. I like haven better, actually, because it means it's a safe place to be. Issachar says he'll be a forced laborer. That doesn't sound too promising. And he's compared with a strong donkey, which if you're gonna do labor, you need strength to do it. So he'll be suited for what he's going to have to do. Dan will judge his people. In fact, that's what Dan, the name means, is judge. He's compared with a snake and a viper. Oh my.
Mhm.
So I don't really know why that was. You're not really told much about Dan there. Gad, all I found was he's going to be attacked by raiders, and I didn't find any metaphors.
I just write overcomer, and I'm not even sure what that means.
Well, that means that he wins, that he's going to be attacked by raiders, but he wins.
Okay.
So an overcomer would be that, you know. Like when you overcome a difficulty, you conquer it, you find a way to get around it. Asher, it says he's gonna produce royal food. And again, I didn't find a metaphor for him.
Bread, something about fat. I can't read my writing.
Oh, okay. Well, if he's producing royal food, it would probably be rich food, yeah. Naphtali, I didn't find any adjectives or descriptions, except that the metaphor was a doe with beautiful fawns.
For Naphtali,
Uh-huh. What did you
why
do?
did I write hind let loose?
Well, because a hind is a word for a deer.
Okay.
So, you know, it's not captive, it's, you know, free to gracefully run and jump and, you know, be free. And Joseph, he is the prince of his brothers, and he's compared with a fruitful vine. Benjamin will be a successful warrior, and he's compared with a wolf, which sounds negative, but I guess a wolf would be, it's a strong predator, you know, so he's a strong warrior.
Is that why Saul came from Benjamin?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, Benjamin and Judah were the two tribes that together made the kingdom of Judah. So, which two sons got the two longest prophecies?
Joseph and Judah.
Judah and Joseph, yep. And now she asked you to look at Hebrews chapter 11, you know, the faith chapter. By faith, Abraham did such and such, and by faith, Isaac did such and such, and by faith, Jacob blessed his sons. Why do you think Hebrews calls these blessings or prophecies an act of faith?
I noted hope in God's promises.
I was thinking, yeah, along those lines. He's getting ready to die. He's not going to have any time to see if what he says about him comes true or not. But this is what he believes. So I think in that sense, it's an act of faith. I think sometimes we give our children names that we hope they'll live up to, you know. So that naming the child might be an act of faith. Or we teach them certain things that is an act of faith that we might not even be around to see the fulfillment. I don't know if that's what Jen was thinking, but that's what I thought. He's getting ready to die, but he's telling them what's going to happen to them or their tribe in the future. And then 12, next to whom does he say he wants to be buried?
His father's, whatever,
Two.
Abraham, Sarah, Isaac,
And there I
Leah, and
buried
Rebecca.
Leah. So finally, Leah is getting the honor that she is due because she was the first wife.
Yes.
And so he doesn't say, bury me beside Rachel. You bury me in my father's tomb. That's very significant.
And the fact that he buried Leah there, I found that very significant.
Well, he probably
Before-
couldn't get any other place.
He
to
could have
Rebecca,
dumped
she
her in a
died.
hole in the ground.
Well,
if he
but
wanted
remember,
to.
Rachel was buried along the way.
Yeah.
So there,
So
if he
it-
wanted to,
Yes.
he could have, but and maybe it is that even if you're feeling one way, you still honor tradition or what's expected, and that would have been the expected thing. You honor your first wife, you know. And so he did. He buried her in the.
Well, and the whole family is together.
Right. So, and that's where Joseph wants his bones to be put. you know, that was very important. And then Jen has been talking about the fact that we see sometimes Jacob is referred to as Jacob, sometimes he's referred to as Israel, and even God sometimes calls him Jacob, sometimes calls him Israel, which is very unusual. What about the first 3 verses in Isaiah that you looked up? What did you find there?
He was Israel. No, yes,
He was
Is
both.
yes.
Because 27:6, Jacob will take root, Israel will blossom. At 41:8, but you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen. Isaiah, do not fear, you worm, Jacob,
Yeah,
you men of Israel. So it's like he has shown both sides of his character so consistently, you know, and God just calls him both, you know. It's sort of like, I love all of you, you know. I
What
see
you
your
are
weakness,
before- yes.
and I see your strengths. I accept them all, and you're mine. I've chosen you, which is kind of comforting. And I didn't see either Israel or Jacob in the last one, but let me just read what I just copied down the verse. I, Yahweh, have called you for a righteous purpose, and I will hold you by your hand. I will appoint you to be a covenant and a light to the nations, in order to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners. Do those phrases remind you of anything you've heard about someone else?
It's about Christ.
It's about Christ. He's a light to the Gentiles. He's the light of the world. He said one time, God has sent me to, or appointed me to open blind eyes and to bring out prisoners and set them free. So I thought, if you're talking about Jacob, Israel, his greatest descendant does all of these marvelous things. And so God's purpose always stands. And he sees beyond the weaknesses of the individual people along the way. Okay, well, actually, we got through. That's great. So for next week, finish the remaining 2 days worth of questions.